The initial title for this talk was not Trees and Seas, it was Trees versus Seas. And it was going to be a contest, and we take a vote at the end of the panel, and we decide how we want to save the world. I was told under no circumstances would either of you do that. So we're not going to do that, and we're going to agree that nature-based solutions are going to be an essential part of our path out of this, and that trees and seas are both important. But maybe a place to start is just explain your unique approach and how you are going about each of your organizations.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for having me. And it's always nice to get outside of speaking just to ocean people, because I want to convert all the non-ocean people to just be ocean lovers, ocean allies, and I appreciate the opportunity to be doing this here today. I would say that from our perspective, the number one priority is creating solutions. We have all the data, we have all the scientific facts. What we don't have is a pipeline of solutions to be able to tackle all these problems. And the way we're doing it is from the grassroots level, so we're empowering young people all over the world. We have the largest network of young ocean leaders in over 168 countries. And these youth are rolling up their sleeves. They're not protesting and being angry. They're actually out there building. They're planting mangrove forests. They're creating advocacy campaigns to protect our deep sea. They are out there, being solutionists in this space. And then on the other hand, we also support and accelerate for-profit ocean startups, so companies that might be creating new innovations that will revolutionize and re-engineer industry. So we tackle this from the perspective of the entire spectrum of a grassroots solution that's very localized, all the way to a company that could become, the billion-dollar company, or the ocean narwhal, as I like to call it, as opposed to the unicorn, right, of the sea. And that's our approach in how we're tackling the sustainability of the ocean.
Points for the narwhal reference. Totally there with you.
So our approach is very similar to what you see in other infrastructure. And how we got to where we are is that we have a certain way of doing business. So when you look at how we manage forests, and then you realize that over 40% of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere comes from the loss and degradation of forests, you say, well, why are we degrading our forests? Why are we losing our forests? We all love forests. They're good for our health. They're good for our well-being. They give us water. They give us air. They give us all of our biodiversity. And it's because you make money by converting forests to other uses and by having the fastest possible turn on your management to a commodity product. So our approach was to say, how can we take all of the skills and knowledge that we have developed to turn forests into a commodity producer and instead drive those towards actual forest management? I like to say we put the forest back in forestry, and we look at conservation as a very active sport. So how can we make those things deliver a competitive return to the model that we have that is driving this degradation and loss? And so our approach has been to develop new financial incentives and new markets to pay for people to manage their forests as forests, inclusive of the commodities that we rely on, but not limited to that. And making all the knowledge and the technology that we have about managing forests, turning those to be the support of forests, not the purpose.
Yeah, I think there's some commonalities here in terms of how we see our natural resources, and we are moving past the time where forestry was just clear-cutting fields and taking all the wood and then waiting for the trees to grow back eventually, or just overfishing and taking all the resources out. Obviously, we need to strike this kind of balance. And it sounds like both of you are saying there are ways to do this that can both support businesses and preserve the ecosystems. Maybe talk a little bit about just the approach to how to do that, the intelligent way to use these resources.
Well, one of the first things is to recognize, we recognize in our built infrastructure environment that there's a value to what we call public-private partnerships, and that there are public benefits to things like roads, and there are private benefits to things like roads. So we direct public investment into those sectors because you get both things. But we don't do that in general for nature. And so what we advocate is to take that same public-private partnership approach. Public investment in the public goods, and certainly addressing climate change is a very powerful public good. You could say it was a foundational and survival public good. And harnessing that to work with private capital, which manages for us for the commodity outputs. So the issue here, and it's highly, highly cost effective, is to drive public investment to partner with private ownership in the management of forests to get the climate outputs as well as the commodity outputs.
And what I would add in terms of the ocean space, just to give you a very quick historical lesson, in the past 100 years, we have been treating the ocean as a place to extract, to benefit from, to use for shipping, to use for exploration. And we've never looked at it as a place that we need to regenerate, that we need to sustain. So we have this unique opportunity right now in that every single industry that touches the ocean is up for grabs in an exciting way because there is so much money to be made. The ocean, its assets are $3.1 trillion a year. The value of the sustainable blue economy is around $23 trillion. So when you look at everything from shipping, fisheries, ecotourism, fashion, the circular economy, every single industry is ready to be disrupted and changed because the way we have been doing business is simply not working out anymore. So when we look at the approach we're taking and seeing how there are so many inventors out there, so many entrepreneurs who have these incredible ideas, the question is how quickly can we get them to scale? Because we no longer have to ask ourselves, oh, is it possible? Would these inventions work? They work, they exist. The question now becomes, of the ones that exist, that are in market, and I can share some examples, which one of them are going to become mainstream? How quickly can they get to the next level of being adopted by different corporations, being merged, being sold off? And so that's the challenge that we see, in that the ocean space is so ready to be transformed and revolutionized, but we're not doing it quickly enough because the capacity of funding isn't there. There's people resisting change. There's so much risk aversion, right? Whenever I talk to investors, they say, oh, the ocean, well, it's a nonprofit thing, right? You give it some money and you plant some corals. I'm like, well, no, actually, you can make real money out of it. And so that's that's something that I like to just people to consider.
So let's give some examples of like the old way of doing things, the traditional way, the thing that's about to be disruptive, and then some ways of doing it better and differently and ideally just as profitably.
Sure. So again, to set the stage, there's 3.1 billion people on the planet that depend on fish, their primary source of protein. So we can't just say don't eat fish, right? That's not realistic. What we can say is there are different ways to sustaining the fish, right? We have one example I'll share. It's called Blue Ocean Gear, and it's a buoy system, right? Which you all have seen. They attach these IoT devices and sensors to fishing nets, and so fishermen can just go out there and retrieve their nets. Because when you look at the Pacific Garbage Patch, a big majority of that is just lost fishing nets. So how can we create something in which a fisherman can just go back and recuperate the fishing net, which is also an incentive for them because they're not wasting money buying new fishing nets, right? Like, I think the simplicity of the things that we're trying to solve and the innovation that's required is something that is incredibly important. I'll give you another example. How many of you know what styrofoam is? How many of you have used styrofoam recently or you've been forced to? Okay. There is a company called Cruise Foam, and they found a way to take chitin, which comes from shrimp shells, and they're creating a foam that is biodegradable and that can replace petroleum-based styrofoam, which is magical and is fantastic. And that's just a couple of examples. You have wave energy examples, right? These buoys that with the movement of waves can produce energy. You have robots that are planting corals, right, to restore different reef systems. And so, the value of the economy is there, and the question just becomes like, again, how can we get more of these entrepreneurs investing human capital to incentivize young people to get into this space, and then bring the capital alongside to help them scale?
Very cool.
And so with forests, what you have pointed out earlier today, and we've heard from a lot of speakers, is a tremendous amount of technological advance. Forests use the original technology of photosynthesis, so there's nothing to be tested out. We know it works. And we also know that forests last a very long time. You know, forests are more than trees. A forest will persist for tens of thousands of years. A really interesting thing is that we think about trees and tree planting. When you plant a tree, it's very small, right? It's like a pencil size. So the carbon is in that tree, the size of the pencil. You think about a big tree, maybe a 50-year-old one might be the size of this table. Some trees will be the size of this entire platform. We are managing for the trees the size of the pencil. We need to manage for the forest. So a difference here, I'll give you an example out of forests that we manage in Oregon. In 20 years, we've quadrupled the amount of carbon that is held in that forest, and at the same time, we've yielded enough timber to frame up about 3,000 homes and provide about 1 million reams of paper. So we are harvesting the forest, but we're harvesting it differently. And in doing that, we employ people every single year, as opposed to when you clear cut and then replant a plantation. You cut once, you plant, you leave it, you come back. You might spray, you might thin, but we employ people every single year. And that's the loggers, it's the people who do the roads, they put in the culverts, it's the folks at the mills, it's the value-added chain there. In another forest that we manage, we have we take off about 1.5 million board foot a year. If anybody cares about board feet, that's a lot. And we have, in that same time period, again, tripled the amount. We've gone from about under 15,000 board foot to the acre to almost 80,000 board foot to the acre, still harvesting every year. This is, as with the oceans, we know how to do this. We have the people power to do it. We have the infrastructure to do it. And we have the legal means to do it. And a critical piece of this for us really is working with known deployable tools. I just have been chairing a process for the state of California to develop targets for what we do with natural and working lands to meet our climate goals. In the next 5 to 10 years, working with a fraction of the land, just a fraction of the land base that we have, a small fraction of it, we can yield between 150 and 400 million metric tons of carbon sequestration gains while supporting a just transition, improving our water supplies, greatly advancing us in our goals towards biodiversity conservation, and building up a rural economy. So, I mean, these are very, very practical, tangible things that we can do. And we need to do them now, because when we look at this issue of what happens in the next 5 to 10 years, we all know what the science is. We need to turn the ship now. And forests are an extraordinarily effective way to turn the ship now and to also have that endure. And I am not talking about offsets. Just want to make that clear.
Yeah, I think I just want to call out Jonathan Kim, when he was up here, said flat out that, you know, he's planting new forests, but it's 10 times more expensive to plant a new one than it is to conserve an old one and manage it better.
Yeah, Kadar, who was speaking earlier today, gave me a great analogy. When you join the workforce, 18 years old, 25 years old, you're going to be earning a certain amount. By the age of 45 or 50, you're going to be earning a lot more in all likelihood. And the issue here is we don't just need to start at year one. We can change, we can show that we're flexible and change at year 30 to really impact the forward going. That piece of time right now that we have is so critical. None of what we're talking about is the magic bullet. But forests are frankly the missing half of the picture right now.
So this is the point in these conversations where I'm like, well, why are we just not doing it? Mm-hmm. What are the obstacles that are holding us back? You know, Daniela, you said, you know, it's financing, it's talent, it's focus. You know, it seems like those fishermen should want the IoT devices on their nets. And you made it, like, why wouldn't they want to get those nets back? What are the blockers here?
Well, the first thing is education, right? I feel as if the ocean has had the worst PR agent in the world because most people don't even understand the value of the ocean as an asset, as an ally to us. So for example, every second breath you take comes from the ocean. Who here actually knew that? a couple of people. The ocean absorbs 30% of CO2 that's out in the atmosphere. So if the ocean stops absorbing those, 1.5 degrees Celsius marks we're talking about would be at 2, 3, 4 degrees by now. And so we're getting to this point where we have to continue educating people about the importance of preserving, conserving, sustaining the ocean. So that's number one. So how can we better educate? How can we, as sustainability leaders, think about holistic, right? I have so many arguments with investors and funders who are like, oh, I fund climate. Like, oh, what do you do in ocean? No, I fund climate, not ocean. But it's one and the same. It's like one holistic system. And so I would encourage all of you, right, as you're doing your respective efforts in sustainability, to think about the ocean as part of the system. I would say the second component of this is the risk. The risk appetite is really difficult to convince funding to go into this space. So we need a lot more philanthropic capital to de-risk these companies, because we're investing in these companies. We have made 62 investments in early stage for-profit companies that, again, can and will make money. But we are the ones writing small check sizes. We're a nonprofit. And the question is, if we were not writing these check sizes, will these companies exist? Who knows? Maybe some of them wouldn't exist. But we need philanthropic capital to come in early on to de-risk. Then we're seeing a lot of companies that are doing phenomenal. For example, we have Navier, that it's a hydrofoil electric boat. It's a boat that flies over water, right? And they're working on their ferry system next. And they need to scale very soon, right? They're raising their Series A and then going above. There's not a lot of funders on the other side in Series B who are ready to provide that capital for scaling. So we're seeing these gaps, these valleys of death on the funding cycle that we desperately need to get more funding in philanthropically and on the investor side. And then policy, don't even get me started with policy. We don't have sufficient policy that even understands the ocean. When you look at the last, the Infrastructure Act, wave energy wasn't even part of that. You had everything around solar and wind, and wave energy is more efficient than both combined because the ocean is always moving. So we just need to do an entire system change of educating, policymakers, investors, funders, and even in young people, and letting them know there are opportunities for you to do something. There is so much climate anxiety out there of young people just knowing that our future is at stake, and yet as a young person, you don't have a seat at the table. You don't have enough money to do anything right now that will actually make a difference. And yet the people who have the decision-making power and the funding are just sitting at the sidelines waiting. And the question that you ask is, waiting for what? For more disasters to happen. We're already living in the greatest crisis that humanity is experiencing, and yet we can move the needle to plant more forests and plant more mangroves and sequester more carbon. So it's definitely something that should be top of mind for all of us.
I think that communication is an enormous part of what we need to accelerate, because more people do need to understand that every time somebody says climate change, you say forests or you say ocean, as opposed to just thinking that it will all be electric cars. But I think another reason behind this is what I would call financial inertia, cultural inertia, and the way things have always been. And frankly, our value chains, you have to think about the whole value chain, because you don't own a forest in a vacuum. You own a forest typically from an investment perspective. You're going to be selling timber, or you're going to be selling land, or in a small portion, you'll be selling some kind of conservation interest. That last part needs to grow. But you sell it to a mill. The mill employs people. That has a political force. It has a community engagement associated with it. There's a whole roster that you need to deal with. All of our economic or financial analyses are always based on the way it was. Well, the way it was based on the value for timber or the value for development. And so those are what drive investors to think that way. When we look at what do we need to do to change, yes, change feels risky. The interesting thing for me is often that when change is imposed upon you, if you have a climate event and your house is flooded, your town is flooded, you change. If gas prices spike, you change. If there is a major disaster and you don't have the ability to sell your timber somewhere, you change. But what we need to do in the recognition of climate change is proactively change. And it's kind of hard to think of proactive change now with climate change in our lives. But if you're my son, who's 22, and we were talking about climate change, and he just said, my generation is screwed. He used a different term. But the point being, that sense of proactiveness is not so much for us, it's for the next generations. Because the Earth, for all of its issues, is more resilient than we may think, but only if we work with it. And I think that's the issue here, is to cut through the inertia and recognize that change in these next 5 to 10 years determines what his and his children's lives look like or not. Because we could be at that million-year cycle otherwise.
Well, I think we've attempted to cut through some inertia here. I could go much longer into both of these things. We'll call it land versus sea a draw. And,
No, this is not a competition. This is a collaboration.
And the last thing that I'll just call to action for everyone in the room is ask yourself, how can you use your own talent, your passion, your time to do something against this crisis? Because if you're not doing anything, you're working against everyone else that is. And we are running out of time. I'll just share that before getting on stage, I saw images of Ecuador on fire. I was born there. And not to get emotional, but our world is truly on fire. And unless we all get together and act, we have to turn the tides. And I ask all of you to do your part and to join us in this movement to protect our forests and our oceans.